Ladies and gentlemen, the following will begin shortly. Please be seated. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Her Excellency President Tsai. It is our great privilege to have Her Excellency Madam President Tsai Ing-wen as the annual group speaker to attend and open the 2023 Taipei Security Dialogue. Welcome. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome all of you home and aboard to the 2023 Taipei Security Dialogue, hosted by Institute for National Defense and Security Research. It is my honor to be the host today. My name is Aya. To begin, I would like to invite the chairman of INDSR to deliver his opening remarks. Please welcome Chairman Huo Shouye. Chairman Huo, please.
President Tsai, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2023 Taipei Security Dialogue. First and foremost, I would like to express my gratitude for the generous support of the Mainland Affairs Council and Mega International Commercial Bank. In this turbulent and unsettled era, natural disaster, conflicts, and wars threaten the survival of humanity. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Israel-Hamas conflicts remain unresolved and with no clear end in sight. With China's ever-expanding ambitions and continuous escalation of the threat to Taiwan, people are deeply concerned about whether a third war could erupt in the Taiwan Straits within the Indo-Pacific region. Today is a great honor to have invited distinguished guests from around the world, including the US, the UK, Germany, France, the Czech Republic, Turkey, Japan, Australia, India, Singapore, and experts and scholars from Taiwan to collectively focus on China's challenges to the global order and democracy. We greatly look forward to the collective effort of countries in the Indo-Pacific region and around the world to seek peace and stability in the region and the world, as well as to prevent humanity from being plunged into another catastrophe of war. This is also the theme of today's dialogue. I hope all participants may derive valuable conclusions. Now, let's warmly welcome Her Excellency Madam Tsai Ing-wen, the President of the Republic of China.
Thank you for the remarks, Chairman Ho. Please return to your seat. And now, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Her Excellency Madam President Tsai Ing-wen. President Tsai, please.
INDSR Chairman Huo Shouye, and there are quite a number of the members of my government here today as well. Let me introduce them to you. The Secretary General of the President's Office, Lin Jialong, and his Deputy Alex Wang. And also with us today is the Secretary General of the National Security Council, Wellington Gu. And of course, one of the co-sponsors for this event is the Mainland Affairs Council. The chairman is Chiu Tai-san, who is here as well. And ambassadors and representatives, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Good morning. I guess you have jet lag. Let me begin by welcoming you all to the 2023 Taipei Security Dialogue, especially our friends who have traveled to Taiwan to join us here. I also want to take this opportunity to thank INDSR for organizing this event, bringing together experts from around the world to discuss some of the most serious global security issues. We are living at a time of tremendous uncertainty. In recent years, major conflicts and an unprecedented pandemic have destabilized the global economy and threatened the world order. Today, Ukraine continues to fight against the Russian invasion, while conflicts continue to break out in the Middle East. It is clear that we cannot take peace for granted in the face of these mounting security challenges. To make sure that the global order is not eroded during such times of instability, we must remain steadfast in our defense of freedom and democracy. Perhaps the most pressing threat to these values comes from authoritarian regimes. In the Indo-Pacific, escalating gray zone activities have created serious instability in the region. This includes maritime intimidation in the South and East China Seas. Taiwan has in particular been challenged by increasingly frequent incursion incursions into our ADIZ and military exercises in our vicinity. We have also had to face economic coercion and persistent cyber attacks. Taken as a whole, these hybrid tactics are designed to deplete Taiwanese people's confidence in our democracy and to undermine our resolve to defend ourselves. But despite such challenges, we have been encouraged by the many statements of support for regional peace and stability from the international community. Following their summit in Hiroshima this last May, the leaders of the G7 released a communique which reaffirmed, quote, the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait as indispensable to security and prosperity in the international community, unquote. And just last month, during a state visit to the United States, Australian Prime Minister Albanese joined President Biden in expressing their opposition to unilateral changes in the cross-strait status quo. Their example follows that of many other world leaders who have voiced their concerns over the security of our region. The people of Taiwan are determined to protect our own hard-earned freedoms and democracy. Our priority is therefore to enhance our self-defense capability and social resilience. Over the past years, we reinstated 1 year mandatory military service, provided conscripts with more realistic training, and reorganized our force structure to ensure that our servicemen and women can meet the challenges of modern warfare. Our national defense budget has also continued to rise for 8 consecutive years, with a 7.7% year-on-year growth rate, and will account for nearly 2.5% of GDP in 2024. This past September, Taiwan's first indigenous submarine prototype was launched, representing a key milestone in our naval vessel production programs, which was deemed too ambitious to many. All these achievements are testament to our unwavering resolve to defend our country. In addition to building combat capabilities, Taiwan also has had to fight against non-conventional threats. Authoritarian actors, cognitive warfare, in the form of mis- and/or disinformation, attempt to exploit and drive polarization in our free and democratic society. As a democracy, Taiwan's response to disinformation is consistent with democratic principles. We equip our people with the knowledge and tools to refute and report false and misleading information, so as to maintain a careful balance between sustaining the free flow of information and denying information manipulation. Our government provides real-time clarifications of disinformation to the public and share our expertise with international partners. And all civil society organizations have stepped up to provide media literacy training, detailed reports on disinformation, and innovative fact-checking tools. We are also enhancing the resilience of our society by refining reserve training and civil defense. Aside from assisting in military operation, Taiwan's civil defense system provides support with tasks necessary to ensure the continued functioning of the society. We are taking a comprehensive approach to advancing multi-layered deterrence and self-sufficiency in national defense. The Taiwanese people recognize the importance of safeguarding our homeland, not only to ourselves, but also to our neighbors and partners. It bears reminding that Taiwan's security is tied to the security of Indo-Pacific and the world. As a responsible member of the international community, Taiwan will continue working to maintain regional peace and stability while expanding and deepening our partnerships with other stakeholders. Taiwan has proven that it is a secure and reliable partner with a deep commitment to democracy. With democracies around the world facing their greatest tests in a generation, it is crucial that we come together in deterring adventurism and aggression in the region to ensure a peaceful future and the continuation of our shared values. I want to thank you all for being here today, hoping to develop a better understanding of the threats that we face and a vision of sustained freedom, democracy, and security in the region. I'm sure today's discussion will contribute towards a freer, more peaceful global community. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President Tsai, for addressing the opening ceremony. Madam President, please return to your seat. We want to take this opportunity to invite our guests come up to the stage to have a memory photo to recall this important moment. Before that, please allow us to set up for the photo section. And later, we're going to invite our foreign guests come up to the stage to have the seat first. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the distinguished guest for the first row, Dr. Tomoko Ako. Dr. Malcolm Davis. Dr. Joseph Sabo. Dr. Jack Watling. Dr. Matt Brown. Dr. Aka Achaya. Dr. Bates Gill. The Honorable John Whitley. Director Carrie Began. Dr. Julia Famularo. Dr. L. Venkandes Warren. Director Roderick Lee. Senior Advisor Christopher Johnstone. Dr. Zhang Jiaying. Now I would like to invite distinguished guests for the second row. Deputy Secretary General Xi Sijian. Minister Chiu San-tai. Minister Chiu Tai-san. Secretary General Gu Li-xiong. Chairman Huo Shouye. Secretary General Lin Jialong. Chairman Lei Zhongda. Director General Miao Huifen. The CEO Chen Mingqi. The Vice Minister Chen Liguo. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's once again welcome Her Excellency President Tsai Ing-wen. I would like to invite our ladies and gentlemen, first of all, look at the front of the camera. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please look at the behind the medias. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, many thanks to Madam President Tsai Ing-wen and all the distinguished guests for gracing the opening ceremony of the 2023 Taipei Security Dialogue. with your presence. First of all, we would like to invite our President Tsai. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated on the stage for a while. Due to her tight schedule, Madam President has to leave us for the next agenda. Please join me once again with a round of applause in extending our gratitude to Her Excellency, Madam President Tsai Ing-wen, for making an appearance this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, you may now return to your seat. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the forum will begin shortly. Simultaneous interpretation device is provided at the reception area. Please use your ID or business card to borrow one. Thank you for your cooperation. Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin the forum, please have a break before 9:30. We will once again begin our forum at 9:30. Please be back before 9:30. Thank you. The forum will begin in 5 minutes. Please kindly take your seat. The forum will begin in 5 minutes. Please kindly take your seat. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the forum will begin shortly. Please be seated. The forum will begin shortly. Please be seated. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the forum will begin shortly. Please kindly take your seat. The forum will begin shortly. Please kindly take your seat. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated as we're about to begin the forum. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. Thank you for your cooperation. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated as we are about to begin the forum. Thank you for your cooperation. Ladies and gentlemen, now we officially begin the forum. It is our great honor to have the Honorable Ms. Michelle Foleroy, who is the former U.S. Under Secretary of Defense for Policy, as the keynote speaker today. But before we bring her to you, I would like to invite the host, Dr. Chen Mingqi, the CEO of INDSR, to introduce the keynote speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Chen.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's both an honor and a privilege to introduce our distinguished keynote speaker, the Honorable Ms. Michelle Foleroy. Michelle Foleroy is the co-founder and the managing partner of the West Exec Advisors. She's also the former co-founder and the chief executive officer of the Center for New American Security, CNAS, where she presently holds the position of the chair of the board of directors. Between 2009 and 2012, she assumed the critical role of Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, where she acted as the principal advisor to the Secretary of Defense on matters concerning national security and defense policy. Her responsibility extends to the oversight of military plans and operation and participation in crucial National Security Council deliberations. Her leadership was evident in the formulation of the Department of Defense 2012 Strategic Guidance, a document of immense importance in guiding the U.S. defense priorities. Ms. Foleroy's career also featured her co-leadership of the President Obama's transition team at the Defense Department, further demonstrating her exceptional capabilities. Her previous role as a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and as a research professor at the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University underscore her long-standing commitment to the field. Ms. Foleroy's insight into the challenge and opportunities facing the Indo-Pacific region are particularly noteworthy. She highlights the critical importance of the robust U.S. deterrence in maintaining peace in the face of China's rapidly advancing military capabilities. Her vision advocates for the demonstration of credible deterrence, showcasing U.S. resolve and preparedness to defend its interests. Her approach aims to prevent conflict that would be detriment to both the United States and China, emphasizing the need to make the cause of aggression clear. Ladies and gentlemen, it's with great anticipation that we welcome Ms. Michelle Foleroy to share her invaluable insight with us today. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to our distinguished keynote speaker. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that very warm and kind introduction. I really wish I could be there with you in person, but I'm honored to be speaking at the Taipei Security Dialogue with you today. When I think about how we will look back at this period of time, 20 or 30 years from now, I think we will agree that we're at a geopolitical inflection point. We're at a turning point where the decades where globalization was the dominant trend with more and more integration among our economies and our societies and an increasingly shared international rules-based order, I think this will be the moment when we saw forces start to turn towards a more disintegrated international system, towards a more multipolar world with various competing power centers. I think there are a number of key drivers of this trend. The first and probably most important for you all in the Indo-Pacific is the rise of a more assertive China, one that is not satisfied with the status quo, one that is bent on trying to change some of those rules of the international order and to assert its will as its economic and military power grows. At the same time, we've seen the return of a revisionist Russia, a Russia that is seeking, under Vladimir Putin, to reestablish Russia's sphere of influence as a great power, not to rebuild the Soviet Union per se, but to try to create greater Russian influence over its periphery. And we've seen that as a primary motivation for Putin's invasion of Ukraine. We also, though, see the persistence of some powers who are unwilling to embrace the international order. Rogue states like North Korea, like the current regime in Iran, and so forth. This sort of move towards greater disintegration and multipolarity is really is a huge problem, particularly when you think of the nature of and seriousness of the transnational threats that we are facing. Climate change, preventing a future pandemic, proliferation of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, the persistence of terrorism, as we've tragically witnessed in the Middle East in recent weeks. All of these transnational threats, which are growing, require greater international cooperation, and that becomes increasingly difficult as we move towards greater multipolarity. If that wasn't enough to further complicate and make the challenge even more difficult, we're also in a time of profound technological disruption. So the technologies that have given the United States and its allies, and I would say Taiwan, its economic edge, its security edge, many of those technologies will not define the future. Rather, a new set of technologies, be it artificial intelligence or quantum computing, synthetic bio, and so forth. These will define who has the advantage in the future. And so that is an additional complicating factor in this changing and very volatile geopolitical environment. So, there's so many different issues we could discuss today, from the war in Ukraine to the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza. But because this is the TAIPEI Security Dialogue, I really want to focus on the future of the Indo-Pacific in particular, and the question of how we deal with an increasingly assertive, if not aggressive, China under Xi Jinping. And I just want to note, there are times when people ask, why this increased tension between the US and China? What has really changed? Is it US policy? Is it something else? And I, from my perspective, having dealt with the Chinese relationship for many, many years, the Beijing relationship, it really was the shift from President Hu to President Xi. Under Hu and leaders before him, China was very much internally focused on its own economic development, on bringing elements of its population out of poverty into the middle class, building its own economy, and it was not nearly as assertive on the world stage. With the arrival of President Xi, that really changed, and China sort of dropped the mask, or the veil, if you will, and started to really flex its muscles economically, taking coercive measures against other countries, militarily, building up its military, starting to use that military much more assertively, particularly in the South China Sea and the East China Sea and the environs of Taiwan, and just generally starting to really challenge the rules of the road of the international order much more aggressively. And so we're dealing with a different China, I guess is what I'm trying to say, than we have historically in modern times. And so our strategies had to change, and our policy has had to change. So as I think about this new environment, I want to focus on 5 areas where I think we should be paying particular attention and investing a lot of our time and effort. The first, as was mentioned in the introduction, is deterrence. And what I mean by that is, efforts to really prevent a U.S.-China conflict over, whether it's over Taiwan or something else. But such a war involving the great powers and others, presumably, would be truly catastrophic for everyone and for the global economy. And so deterrence is really the name of the game, both deterrence by denial, meaning we need to be able to convince President Xi that he can't be successful using military force to achieve his objectives, and deterrence through cost imposition, meaning even if he could succeed, it would be at such great cost that it would be a Pyrrhic victory. It would not be worth the incredible cost to China and to its standing and influence, to its economy, and so forth. I do think that for the moment, given all of his domestic challenges, given the state of his military, President Xi is focused. When it comes to Taiwan, he's focused, as you all know better than anybody else, on economic and political coercion, shrinking Taiwan's space, putting pressure on Taiwan to change, its posture. But we also know that he has instructed his military, the PLA, to be able to give him options, military options, by 2027. And so I believe we, the United States, our allies, Taiwan, the international community, we collectively need to be ready for a moment in the late 20s when deterrence may be tested. And we need to be prepared for that and to be confident that President Xi, if he does test the waters of using force, that he will conclude that it's too risky and too costly and he cannot succeed. The second key focus area is really strengthening our alliances and partnerships and making sure we are aligned in how we see the challenges and the opportunities, but also how we act collectively. Diplomatically, we know that when China has overreached in the past, when we're able to muster a coalition of like-minded states and entities to push back together, that is much more effective than any single state, making a diplomatic objection. So really working to build the consensus, the coalition to push back on bad behavior on the part of Beijing is a very important element. But of course, we also need to be shoring up our collective defenses. First and foremost, we need to continue to deepen our assistance to Taiwan to be able to defend itself. And I think the moves you are taking towards using more asymmetric measures and coming up with a layered defense that would really complicate life for the PLA if they tried to use force against you is very, very important. But in addition, I think the US and allies and partners also need to continue to shore up our capacity in the region. You see the administration, the Biden administration, very much focused on this, announcing the AUKUS initiative with the UK and Australia, much more deepening of trilateral work with US, Australia, and Japan. Much more revitalized and productive Quad, bringing in India, and even many of our posture initiatives, working more closely with the Philippines, for example, and others in the region. So the shoring up our defensive capabilities alongside our diplomacy is very, very important. The third area of focus that I would highlight is really investing to build out our shared toolkit for resisting Chinese economic coercion. So much of what we're seeing right now is economic coercion. And honestly, I feel like this is an area where we need to improve our game. We need to have better responses, better tools to push back against Chinese economic coercion. Obviously, we need to invest in new instruments and approaches on a national basis, but I also think there's work we could do collectively to assess where are our dependencies on China, dependencies that may become vulnerabilities in a crisis, dependencies that China could use as leverage to try to, again, for coercive purposes. And we need to invest in reducing our these individual these particular areas, and we can do that by working together to invest in much more diversified and resilient supply chains that are not wholly dependent on China. I think we can also collaborate when a country or an entity is the object of coercion. We can work more collectively to try to, respond and fill the gaps for each other, reduce the pain for each other. So this is going to require some proactive thinking, strategy, planning before we're ever in a crisis, if we're going to have the kind of economic tools at our disposal to shore up deterrence and response in a crisis. I think the fourth thing I'd focus on, and maybe this is so obvious it doesn't require being stated, but it is investing in the drivers of our own competitiveness at home. This is true for the US, it's true for Taiwan, it's true for others. Accelerating our innovation, making sure that our economies are strong. These are areas where, again, there's a lot that we need to do individually, but there's also much more that we could be doing together to make sure that we stay on the cutting edge of new technologies, of the technologies that are going to define which economies grow, which are most robust, which countries have the best security in the future. And the last thing I'll say is, of course, we have to think, we have to engage China. There's so much where we share interests in working problems like climate change, non-proliferation, and so forth together. But we also have a shared interest in reducing the current level of tensions and trying to stabilize the environment. I do think that when President Xi comes to the United States for the summit at the end of this year, later this year, I think both presidents, Xi and Biden, have this objective in mind, to sort of stabilize the situation, put a floor under the relationship, if you will, and to reduce some of the tensions. I don't expect there to be any major policy changes on either side. I don't expect more than somewhat symbolic deliverables, but I do think increasing dialogue, whether it's restarting military to military dialogue or dialogue on arms control, on other issues, I think that's very, very important. We need to find ways to reduce the level of tension, to reduce the level of risk, and to create space for cooperation where it's in our mutual interests. So I'd like to stop there and just again thank you for inviting me to speak. And I think if there's time available, I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Honorable Ms. Flournoy. We'd like to take several questions, but before that, I summarize the 5 pillars to defend ourselves, defend the democracy, including investing in our toolkits to resist China's economic coercion, investing in our own economy to strengthen our coalition, and last, to improve our deterrence against China's aggression, and thus it's about engaging with China. I think that's all very important. I think build alliance, deterrence, invest in deterrence, then engage with China. I think that is the formula to advance the peace and stability in this region and beyond. So we thank you for the generality of time. So we can take several questions. So I think we take 2 first, and then if we have time, then we can take more. So anyone on the floor would, yes, Ian.
I could just speak loudly, but I don't think Ms. Bono would hear me.
Now.
No, it's okay. I'll bring you the mic. Thank you. Very good to see you again, Secretary Flournoy. So my question is on the engagement bit. Very simple question. So on what terms should states be thinking about engaging with China on? And how would you suggest states and other entities consider the question of commitment on the PRC side? They could, of course, make some promise, but walk away from it. We've seen that with, say, the Sino-British Joint Declaration over Hong Kong. Thank you.
Right. So, I think, I do think engaging directly with President Xi and the leadership is important because, we've seen under President Xi, China move from a collective leadership model really to a one-man model. And when we communicate with others, in the traditional bureaucracy or the ministries, it's a real question as to whether any of those messages actually make it all the way up to the top. And so I think, at least from a U.S. perspective, I think it's very important that President Biden sit down face to face with President Xi and describe to him how we see things, how we see our interests, how we see Chinese actions, what our objectives are, what we're trying, how we'd like to see things move forward. Talking doesn't mean compromising. It doesn't mean, conceding or giving up your core interests. It just means you have an opportunity to communicate very clearly and very directly. And I think this is particularly important also not only at the presidential level, but on the military-to-military front, on the arms control front. We know that there are elements of Chinese doctrine that are based on fundamentally erroneous assumptions about us. It's really important that we have a dialogue where we can have an opportunity to let that, to try to educate them on that or to share a very different perspective. So I think, but to your point, I think we have to be very careful about things like joint declarations and joint statements, because here there's a history of putting out a joint statement where we think we're agreeing on the terms and then having China either interpret those terms in a completely different manner than what was intended, by the US or others, or simply depart from those in the future. So I think we have to be very clear-eyed, we have to be careful, we have to be smart. But in my view, the communication and the dialogue is very, very important. And it's essential to manage the risks that we are facing with such an assertive China.
Yes. Okay, one more questions from the floor. Yes.
Good morning. My name is Martin Laflamme. I'm with the Canadian Trade Office here in Taipei. Building on the question of engagement, as I'm sure you've experienced yourself, China often uses engagement as a reward for what it sees as good behavior on the parts of its partners. So how do we entice Beijing into having some discussions with us when it will often be reluctant to talk just because it feels the relationship is not ready for discussion?
Yeah, I think what's interesting to me right now is, at least at the nation state level, in many cases, China is reaching out. China is wanting the engagement. We just saw the Australian Prime Minister go to China. China was very welcoming of that visit. They actually, made some policy changes in advance of the visit to set a good atmosphere. To me, that is China responding in an environment where Australia stood up to their coercion. Australia's relationships with others in the region are strengthening. Its position is strengthening. So I think, if you have to approach China with real fortitude and strength, but when, I think that can also induce them to come to the table in a more productive manner as well. And I think the Australia case study is where they've been in the last couple of years and how China is now welcoming engagement with them. It's not rewarding, concessions on Australia's part. It's quite the opposite. It is recognizing that coercion didn't work, and that they have to deal with Australia, on a different basis.
Okay, because of time, thank you very much. Sorry that we have to cut short of this conversation, but we have a standing invitation extended to you, so next time please do visit in person in Taipei. You will find that we have built a vibrant democracy and a very prosperous life here.
I look forward to coming again. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And next we are going to take a short break.
Many thanks to the Honorable Michelle Leroy for the excellent keynote speech, and also thank you very much, Dr. Chen. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have the show break now. The next section, Conversation 1, will begin at 10:15. Please be advised to return before 10:15 so we can properly start the next section. We have prepared some refreshment and beverage out of the hall while you are social networking and exchanging ideas. Please be advised to bring your valuable with you at all times. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the next section will begin in 3 minutes. May I invite all of you to take your seat. The next section will begin in 3 minutes. May I invite all of you to take your seat. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the next section will begin shortly. Please be seated. The next section will begin shortly. Please be seated. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the next section will begin shortly. Please be seated. The next section will begin shortly. Please be seated. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the next section will begin shortly. Please be seated. The next section will begin shortly. Please be seated. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the section will begin shortly. Please be seated. The next section will begin shortly. Please be seated. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the forum. Now, we will proceed to the conversation 1, titled The Lessons of Russia-Ukraine War and How to Deter China. There are 3 discussants in this section, respectively from USA, UK, Czech Republic. Now please welcome the moderator, Dr. Jiang Qichen, legislator of Legislative Yuan. Now I turn the floor to Legislator Jiang, please.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. And thank you so much for inviting me to this very important dialogue. It's Taipei Security Dialogue. And welcome all the guests from Taiwan and from international community. And I think, again, Welcome to Taipei. I'm the legislator, Johnny Zhang, currently the legislator in the Committee for Foreign Affairs and National Defense. And I will be moderating this panel to talk about the Russia-Ukraine war and its implication for the Taiwan Strait and perhaps for the region. And so as a legislator, I have been served in the Committee for National Defense and Foreign Affairs for more than 10 years. I got my PhD from South Carolina and Pittsburgh from the US. And I think perhaps one thing related to our guest, that would be I was in the military service during the 1996 crisis. In that time, I was the, we call Marine Corps in Army. It's kind of different from the typical Marine Corps, but it's one kind of Marine Corps. But anyway, that's my experience. And so I'm so honored to be here with our three very distinguished and very important guests. And they are going to be our discussion in this panel. That including the Honorable Dr. John Wiley, Dr. Jack Wadley, and Dr. Max Brown. First of all, Dr. Wiley served as the acting U.S. Secretary of the Army under Biden and as Assistant Secretary of Army under Trump. So I think you should be, we can say you are non-partisan. And Dr. Wiley earned both a master and doctorate degree in economics from the University of Chicago. And the second one, Dr. Wadley, is a senior research fellow specializing in land warfare at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI. He advised the British military on various aspects of military operations. Dr. Wadley earned his PhD in history from Birkbeck, University of London. And last but not least, Dr. Brown is the director of the Institute of International Relations, PREC. His research interests include comparative regionalism, the European Union, and the global environmental politics. Dr. Brown earned his PhD in political science from Charles University. We are very lucky to have these three highly educated and experienced and accomplished guests today to share their extensive expertise and thoughts on this topic. Let's again welcome three guests. But before the panel start, I would like to say some rules about our discussion. That would be each discussion has 10 minutes for your presentation. And after the first round, then we're gonna have the Q&A section, and then I will open the floor to the guest today in this dialogue. And so hopefully we can conclude the panel by 15 minutes. So now let me turn the floor to Dr. Wiley to present his thoughts regarding the panel's topic. Again, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Shen. It's a great honor to be here, Dr. Chang and my fellow panelists. Thank you. So I'll just run through a couple of quick points of what I've observed with respect to the war in Ukraine and some of its implications for how we think, how the U.S., how the United States thinks about China and Taiwan. I'll talk at kind of the middle level. I think we got a great talk by Michelle that was at the very strategic level, and there's been a tremendous amount of great work done on what's going on in Ukraine with respect to drones, with respect to persistent surveillance, with respect to loitering munitions, et cetera. There's been a great deal of work at the tactical level, and I'll kind of talk between those two levels. kind of where Department of Defense, U.S. Department of Defense policymakers need to be thinking. The first point I'd make is I'd look at the decision-making and the mobilization timelines for the United States in Ukraine. The buildup, as everybody recalls, went on for several months. The intelligence community was very convinced that this buildup was different than prior buildups, was more likely to be an actual invasion, a prelude to an actual invasion. And the U.S. did not engage in sizable deployments, really didn't even engage in sizable sanctions and other activities until after hostilities started. And I think that's very consistent with the U.S. behavior in past conflicts. It takes a considerable amount of time to work through domestic decision-making processes, partner and ally engagement processes, building domestic support for a mobilization and potential engagement. So I think the first lesson learned I would highlight is it would be unusual for the U.S. to mobilize significantly prior to the onset of hostilities. And I think that has a couple of very significant implications for Taiwan and for the United States. First, unfortunately, what that means is that the window by which Taiwan has to hold on is real and tangible and needs to be thought about. It needs to be a primary focus of the dialogue between the U.S. And Taiwan. How realistically quickly can we get here? Within the U.S., where I'm going to focus my remarks and where I spend most of my time, it means that we need to be thinking more about things like inside posture. The replacement for time to get here is to be here at the start. We spent a lot of time in a very good way. We spent a lot of energy and a lot of our investment focus to date since the 2018 and through the 2022 NDS on standoff, on long-range fires, on a variety of capabilities that enable us to operate more effectively outside of the A280 umbrella. Those are important investments, but I think now we need to, and a lesson learned from Ukraine, is that now we need to turn to that inside force posture and the types of capabilities and the types of investments and technology advances that we need to be able to survive and operate effectively in an A280 environment. The second point I'd make, which relates very closely to this and leads to some of the same conclusions, is looking at the U.S.'s behavior with respect to Ukraine. What did we do and what did we not do? The most obvious thing is what we did not do is we did not provide forces to engage kinetically with the Russians. We do have a long history of support for the territorial integrity of allies. World War I was about that, World War II was about that, Korea was about that, Vietnam was about that, Kuwait was about that. So every 20 years, the U.S. does commit forces to support its allies and the territorial integrity of allies. That's a very consistent factor in U.S. history. But another consistent factor in U.S. history since the advent of nuclear weapons is we're very reluctant to engage with the forces, the mainland, to directly engage kinetically with nuclear powers. We have fought proxy wars, Vietnam, where we localized it to the theater, Korea in some ways. Again, China was not a nuclear power at that time, but we localized the conflict to the Korean Peninsula. So that, again, I think has implications about what types of authorities would the Department of Defense, the U.S. Department of Defense, likely receive, and how quickly would they receive those authorities. It would be unusual, as with the first item, it'd be unusual for the U.S. to deploy significantly prior to the onset of hostilities. It would also be unusual for the U.S. to engage kinetically with the mainland of China, and it might even be unlikely to engage significantly with Chinese forces off-island early in the conflict. Now, you could envision a conflict evolving many different ways. If China were to aggressively engage with U.S. forces at Kadena and other places early, that could change that equation. But if it were to evolve as past conflicts that the U.S. has been involved in, there might be an effort to localize it. And some of the implications are the same. If authorities to engage with force, with overwhelming force, are going to be slow in coming and maybe limited early. That affects how long Taiwan has to hold on. That affects what types of investments the U.S. needs to be making. And being here and being survivable becomes more important. A third observation that I would make, that again, these first three kind of all relate together and all kind of lead in the same direction. A third point I'd make is the nature of the war in Ukraine, and I'd add, at least preliminarily, the nature of the war in Israel with Gaza. Certainly the Ukraine war and likely the Israeli war are protracted. These are not 2-week, 3-week encounters that are over. They're extending on. Obviously, Ukraine is over a year and a half now. Israel is already over a month with no near-term end in sight. And they're certainly all domain as in they include a ground component as well as the other domains of warfare. And so I think sometimes we in the United States tend to be optimistic. The nature of war is changing. Technology changes everything. The next war will be short. The next war will be primarily a missile exchange. We won't have to go through the agony and the pain that comes with protracted ground war. But I think what Ukraine and Israel demonstrate to us is we really need to focus on realism and what's happening in the world. And protracted all-domain conflict, including the ground domain, is still the norm and should be the expectation of future conflict. That leads to, again, similar things, the ability to survive and operate inside an A280 umbrella. Have we invested enough in that? There's several things I'd point to. I've got some other things. I'm going to run out of time here. So let me just summarize those. Some of the things the U.S. is doing that I think is moving in the right direction. We've built a training center in Hawaii and Alaska, and a mobile component to that that's going around. It's gone to Indonesia twice. It's been in Australia. I think that's a big part of this, the ability to work with partners and allies within the region, train in the region with the relevant players. Those of you who are familiar with the military side will know about Operation Pathways, and we really are trying to get 10,000 to 20,000 folks west of the international date line for an extended period of time. And then, you know, if you have inside posture, you need to be able to sustain it. You need to be able to supply it. You need to be able to maintain it. You need to be able to protect it. And so the military term for that is interior lines. We do have, you know, long-standing interior lines for the north, but we don't from the south, and we don't in the southeast, southwest. So, you know, building out the infrastructure that it takes to be able to sustain and project military forces from the southern approaches, I think is a key area for future investment. So I've got several other things, but I'm going to run out of time here. So I'll just briefly summarize my other comments and say, you know, I point to the role, I think a key observation from Ukraine is the role that Zelensky played in garnering U.S. support, garnering European support. You know, the famous quote being, I don't need a plane ride, I need bullets, or I need ammunition, or whatever the exact words were. So I think that's an important lesson for Taiwan. You know, what role can Taiwan play? It already is playing, but what additional roles can Taiwan play? And is Taiwan prepared to take the role and do the types of things that Zelensky has done to garner support for Ukraine? And then I'll just close with, you know, will to fight. It's hard to have a conversation in the United States that doesn't end up in some way, shape, or form pointing out to Afghanistan versus Ukraine and the dramatically different. So to get U.S. support, to strengthen U.S. resolve, you know, I think there's questions of, you know, what more can Taiwan do? I know it's difficult to put the onus on others, but the U.S. is a big, diverse country with big, diverse views. What more can be done to garner support, to marshal support? The president, in her remarks, talked about the increases in defense spending. I think that's an important signal to the world and to the United States. But I'd also say 2.5% of GDP is still significantly less than, say, the U.S. spent during the Cold War, than the U.S. spends even today. So I would say we need to be thinking about how we're going to gain support from the U.S. and get the U.S. committed. And so I'll pause there.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Willie. I know you have a lot more to say, but time was running so fast. So now let's turn to the second one. Dr. Willie, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. I want to presage my remarks by observing that I hope everything I'm about to say proves to be irrelevant to the future of your country. Having worked in Ukraine for the last 2 years, I can say that conflict is horrific, and the second worst thing to losing a war is winning one. And so I hope this is irrelevant. However, preparing for war is also one of the best ways of avoiding it. So in that light, I'm going to make a few observations about lessons I think do transfer from Ukraine to this theater at the operational tactical level. The first is that very often when people are talking about a straits contingency, they talk about a hybrid contingency, a gray zone contingency, they talk about a sudden attempt to seize Taiwan, they talk about a salami slicing process where it's your outer islands that are threatened first, and they talk about a long war through a blockade and through coercion. These are not different contingencies. The thing that we learned from Ukraine is that the gray zone sets the conditions for the eventual fight. And the decisions that are made in order to effectively contest in the gray zone to stabilize the situation for your government before an invasion determines how prepared you are for it. In Ukraine, if they had mobilized early, they would have made themselves very economically vulnerable. But at the same time, the failure to mobilize meant that the original process of mobilization in Ukraine was extremely chaotic. And so how you manage these conflicting imperatives, how do you not expend too many munitions to win the initial fight, if that means that you then cannot bridge the gap to your partners coming and assisting you, is a critical process. So we have to look at all of these contingencies as joined and sequenced. The second thing I want to highlight is picking up on this point of the Zelensky moment, as it were. Your survival in the initial days is critical, but in Ukraine we had ammunition for 3 or 4 months. And if we didn't get and rally the international community to be able to provide more, then the war would have finished somewhat prematurely. Ukraine's resistance depended upon its allies mobilizing. That mobilization was enabled by a couple of things. It was enabled by a values judgment upon the allies in terms of the need to defend Ukraine's territorial integrity, but it was also enabled by the fact that Ukraine was seen to be a credible investment. Ukraine looked like it could resist. And that wasn't because there was an ingenious defense plan. It was because Ukrainians, in the absence of a plan, mobilized and made very clear that they were determined to fight. And the optics of that really mattered. Not just Zelensky, but also all the videos of people driving past Russian tanks and hitting them with Molotov cocktails, taking absurd risks, but showing their determination. And so a critical part of Taiwan's thinking needs to be, how do you rally the international community so that there is a decisive response early, noting how difficult it will be to achieve resupply. The third point I want to highlight is drawing on the lessons from the maritime side in Ukraine. The observation in the Black Sea is that blockades are really sticky. That is to say that even though the Black Sea fleet has been heavily attrited, it has been constrained in its ability to maneuver, nonetheless, it is still very difficult to assure access to Odessa and other ports because of long-range strike on the port facilities, because of naval mining and the threat from submarines. And that threat against Taiwan is severe. It works the other way, however, and I think that shows cases where there needs to be a priority in investment. One is obviously the ability to deploy smart sea mines. A second is the ability to reseed, and then layer effects, that being electronic warfare in order to maximize the effectiveness of the munitions you have, but also anti-ship missiles and torpedoes. And if you can maintain the credibility of that threat, it has a huge psychological influence on your adversary. Another critical lesson, I think, from Ukraine is that, I hear a lot of people in Taiwan talk about the fact that you have complex terrain, dense urban terrain, mountainous terrain, and that gives you an advantage and it gives you survivability. I think that certainly used to be the case. I think that is not always the case anymore. The survivability of that complex terrain is dependent upon two things. Firstly, the sensor situation. If your adversary has established sensor dominance, then given the fidelity of modern sensors, they will find you in that terrain. And so a critical question for Taiwan's defense is, are you able to degrade and deny and disrupt the enemy sensor capability? That means knocking down longer range UAS. That means disrupting space-based observation. It also means reducing the precision of enemy reconnaissance. If the enemy cannot get a sufficiently accurate Category 1 grid for a target, even if they can see it, then their precision munitions will miss. That has been a persistent lesson from Ukraine. And so how do you knock off the efficiency of the enemy fires? That's something that requires real consideration and careful planning. The other thing is that the protection you get from complex terrain diminishes significantly if the enemy can bring decisive firepower to bear. And the lesson there, I would say, is the contrast between the lack of effectiveness that the Russian Air Force has had in Ukraine versus the impact of the Israeli Air Force against Gaza at the moment. Now, in terms of the ability to drop unguided munitions from medium altitude, the IAF may be much better pilots, but you don't need to be a fantastically good pilot to be able to do that effect. The Russians did it pretty competently in Syria. But what you do need is to be able to fly at medium altitude for the targeting to be reliable. And in Ukraine, the survivability and the endurance of Ukrainian air defense has very substantially limited the VKS's capacity to deliver that effect. If you are not able to sustain the denial of medium altitude aviation over the battle space, your complex terrain will not make you survivable. The weight of munitions that will land on you will simply destroy the forces that are found. And so I think we can see, again, a critical priority for investment, but also an area where the efficiency of your defenses and the layers of your defenses really matter. Because the other thing we've seen in Ukraine is that the use of strike munitions, loitering munitions, are not massively effective in and of themselves, but they are extremely dangerous in their depletion of air defense missiles that are designed to go after higher end threats. And so if you are not able to efficiently disrupt cheap munitions, then it will over time give the enemy more and more opportunities. And the final point I want to make before relinquishing my remaining time is that one mistake, and I'll be fairly blunt in calling it that the Ukrainians have made, is that they have persistently prioritized in their messaging and, in fact, in their planning, technology. Technology is useful, but if we look at why the Ukrainian counteroffensive did not achieve its objectives, it was not about technology. It was because the Ukrainian training system did not deliver a sufficient number of troops who could operate at the required scale. In the Second World War, British infantry received around 22 weeks training in total. Ukrainian troops are lucky if they get 5, 10 if they're going into leadership positions. And the result is a real cap on the scale at which they can employ force and synchronize effects. And so much as people like to look for technological solutions to the threats that we face, because it buys us out of the very dirty and difficult fighting that takes the best of us, the reality is that your ability to resist will come down to the determination and skill of your people, and it is vital that the empowerment of those people to be able to operate when they are separated from their command and control, their willingness to resist in spite of overwhelming enemy fire, is critical to the defense. And so don't underestimate the value of your people. And on that, I will relinquish my remaining time. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I think you have a very real observation, real-time observation and thoughts regarding the Ukraine and Russian war. Now let's turn to the third speaker, Dr. Brown, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you once more for the invitation. It's a true pleasure to be here and to discuss this very important topic. If we go back in time to shortly after 24th of February last year, 2022, I remember traveling through Europe, going from Sweden through Germany, Czechia, through Austria to Italy, and everywhere you would see a lot of Ukrainian flags. Not only in a major city, as in Prague, where you would find Ukrainian flags on official buildings everywhere, but also going up in Italian mountains, in small villages, you would find Ukrainian flags. Strong sign or show of solidarity with Ukraine after being attacked. And this brings me to the point I want to make here about the responses to Russia's attempted full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It was early articulated by Ukraine President Zelensky as an attack on Europe. Very clear that Ukrainians are fighting not only for themselves, but to protect the European lifestyle, to protect democracy. And this was something which was also articulated by European leaders, such as Ursula von der Leyen, who was stressing, the President of the European Commission, also stressing that it's not only an attack of a target of Russia, it's not only Donbass, it's not only Ukraine, it's the entire European order, the security order. And this is something which is important to bear in mind, and where I think there are some lessons also to be learned how to articulate that. I will get back to in a short while, but there has also been some less successful attempts when it comes to gathering the international support. If we look outside of the Western world, if we look to some parts of what is often referred to as the Global South, we can see that it has been much more difficult for Ukraine to gain that international support for its cause. If we stay with this early period a little bit longer, in Europe, it was not only about showing solidarity, there was also a large level of shock. That is, we were largely unprepared. Even if one could argue, and in retrospect, I think many would say that they saw this coming much earlier. Some would say that they saw this could happen already when Mr. Putin gave a speech in 2005 describing the dissolution of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Others argued perhaps that they would see it happening at least when the actual war began. I mean, we know the war began in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, right? Others would speak of different times frames to say when they realized that something like this actually would happen. But what is important to say here, it's not only about shock. If we look at Europe, it's also about what kind of geopolitical vision for Ukraine and countries in the area was held by leaders in Western Europe prior to this, prior to 2022. A common understanding was to view Ukraine and some other countries in the area as a potential bridge to Russia, perhaps as a buffer zone, but less of actually a full engagement of trying to integrate Ukraine into European structures or Western structures, such as NATO and the European Union. If we look at it only with after the beginning of the war, we saw a commitment from European Union leaders that Ukraine will be allowed to potentially become a member state. It's received a candidate status in the European to EU membership in June 2022. We are still waiting for an invitation to Ukraine to become a member state of NATO, but it's quite clear from leaders that that will happen when the security situation allows for it. We had former Director General of NATO, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, speaking a few days ago that he thinks that Ukraine could be invited into NATO even before the war actually ends. Which brings me to the point of how actually to end the war. How can Ukraine win the war against Russia? I don't think anyone, even the most optimist, would assume a full capitulation of Russia. That is, the most optimist account would expect that Russia would withdraw to the borders that were in place prior to 2014. But even if that would happen, and even if we would have a change of regime in Russia, which the question would still remain, how would you avoid the same situation happening again? How would you deal with the persistent existence, continued existence of the security threat? And then again, we get back to the thinking in geopolitical terms that perhaps, or the only solution to that is likely to be Ukraine entering NATO, is likely to be a clear-cut anchoring of Ukraine into those European structures, which will then allow a new order to be built in Europe. And I think I'm not saying what lessons to be drawn for Taiwan coming out of this. I think, though, that it's important to take into account the thinking of the regional structure, the thinking in terms of how to anchor, build cooperation with countries having similar values, a similar outlook, and thus focusing on the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific. I will stop there to allow more space for the discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Brown. Now we, three speakers discuss and all present their point and thoughts regarding the lesson that we can learn or we should learn from the Russia-Ukraine war. But no matter what, I don't know how many people in this room can tell me how to end the current Ukraine war, or how Ukraine can win. I don't know, but I personally really want to know. But so far, I don't know whether we have the people in this room can give the answer. Because for me, I think ending a war is always much difficult than initiating a war. So what we should learn and how we can learn from the current Ukraine war is how to avoid a war. But how to avoid a war regarding how to deter the threat or the invasion from your potential or your enemies. So thank you, three very distinguished guests in this panel to share your thoughts and points. Now I want to open the floor for your question. So if you want to ask any question, please raise your hand, and I will try to keep that the question could be answered. I saw the one over there. this gentleman there, number 1 and number 2 in the end.
Dr. Malcolm Davis Aspey in Canberra. Question really to Jack and also to Mats, and probably all three panelists. It's critical that Ukraine wins the war, because if it doesn't, I think it sows the seeds for a future conflict in Europe that could be much more dangerous. Its counteroffensive has failed, or it's basically dragged to a stalemate. How do we ensure that Ukraine wins in 2024-25, especially given the distraction now with the Middle East and the looming challenge of China threatening Taiwan? How do we motivate political support to avoid that future war? Because I get the impression that even with the shock of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, many in Europe are still not aware of the dangers that now are basically emerging along NATO's eastern frontier. So how do we motivate them to realise the danger that they're in and the essential requirement to ensure that Ukraine wins? And what are the lessons that means for Taiwan, given that once China begins an invasion of Taiwan, we can't resupply Taiwan with weapons in the same way that we have Ukraine?
Okay, let me also correct the second gentleman, and then let the three panelists to answer.
Hi, I'm Guillermo Leillery. I'm from NCCU, a visiting scholar, a retired Air Force guy. Mr. Whitley, I listened carefully to your presentation, and you mentioned it takes time for the U.S. to decide. No forces are committed in Ukraine and in Israel and protracted war. China is already threatening Taiwan, and so I would hope that the U.S. government is already thinking about how it would react to a variety of scenarios. So the time to decide, hopefully, is very quick, and I hope it's working with its partners. I guess I want you to respond to the fact that, yes, there's no forces committed to Ukraine, but there actually are U.S. forces in Taiwan and training Taiwanese forces in the United States. And just as the U.S. committed forces to training Ukrainians in 2014 and lethal training in 2017, there are forces committed, maybe not to fight the Russians, but to help the Ukrainians. And regarding protracted war, this war is going on now with cyber war, media war, propaganda. So how do we think of fighting and helping Taiwan with its war with China, whether it's kinetic or non-kinetic? Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Wee, you want to go first? All right.
So doing them in reverse order.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. I thought those were all great points, and I largely agree with them. The coercive campaign, the gray zone conflict, whatever we want to call it, is certainly ongoing now. How do we engage in that? The U.S. has many different points of view in it. It's a large, diverse country. A lot of our planning is focused on a very high-end, high-intensity, very quick kinetic war. I think that's an important thing to plan for, an important thing to invest for, an important thing to be prepared for. There's a wide range of views in the U.S. that a war-weary country, after Iraq, Afghanistan, and now extended support to Ukraine, is unlikely to engage in yet another war if it were to come along. So I think the challenge for those of us who see the importance of what's happening here and the threat that it imposes to not only Taiwan's interests, but to U.S. interests, to Japanese interests, to Korean interests. I think the challenge for us is how do we promote a conversation that might perhaps be between some of these extremes that we see in the U.S. right now. Got Pentagon planners very focused on a very high-end, high-intensity conflict and how to portray that. That's an important thing to do. I'm glad they're doing that. We've got a large thought process across the political electorate in the U.S. that maybe we just sit the next one out. What's the discussion in the middle? How do we engage today to the gray zone conflicts that you mentioned? How do we educate the American people? How do we get the posture and investments that we would need for some sort of conflict in between the two extremes? I think all of those should be priorities moving forward. And then there's a role for Taiwan to play in that, for helping to educate the American people, for explaining the risks and the challenges and demonstrating its commitment to this problem set.
All right. Dr. Waterly?
On the point about deterrence, I think it's very important to emphasize that we didn't practice it in Ukraine, right? As you say, there were US forces there delivering training, and they were withdrawn. I was there when they were pulled out. The message that was sent was very clear. The other thing is, when the Russians did their test buildup in the beginning of 2024, and the intelligence community reassured everyone that this one wasn't real, and so we did nothing. And then we were told, well, this time it's for real, so we started to do things, but very late. We have to understand, deterrence is cognitive. And the message that Putin took from both of these things was, firstly, the enemy or the adversary will only respond if they are certain, and at the point where they're certain, it's too late for them to materially do something to change the calculus on the ground. Okay? So I can get away with it if it's a short campaign. And the second message that they got from that process was, the US is getting out of my way. They don't want to fight me. They're scared, right? So green light. And so the question is, from a deterrence point of view, are you prepared to change the adversary's calculus? Or are you more about protecting your own position? That feeds into answering the second question on priorities. The first requirement is to fix the training pipeline, so that the training that the Ukrainian armed forces do and the training that their international partners do outside of Ukraine line up better, so that we get an expansion of the scale at which the armed forces of Ukraine can operate. That is critical for effective offensive operations. The second element is making the support that has been provided to Ukraine sustainable, and that requires investment in our industrial base, significant investment in our industrial base. And on that point, when we talk about war termination, I think this ties together very specifically, because at the moment, we keep saying in our information campaigns that, hey, Russia's not as strong as everyone thinks. It's got an economy the size of Italy, right? You'll hear that said a lot. Well, that economy at the moment is producing more ammunition than NATO, okay? So if NATO's being outproduced by an economy the size of Italy, we're doing something wrong. And the Russians can see those numbers, and so what they think is that their prospects get better over time. They think we'll get politically tired. They think our capacity to support the Ukrainian armed forces at scale will diminish. They may be right, they may be wrong about that. I think they're wrong. But the fact that we are not articulating a long-term investment plan and how we deliver the necessary level of material support for a protracted period means that we are sending the wrong messages. And ultimately, if you want, wars end when the loser decides that they end, right? When the loser decides they're going to stop fighting. And so how do you get the Russians into that space? They get into that space when they look at their prospects over time and they just see that they are diminishing, not improving. And at the moment, they're not in that position. So I think, yeah, the training issue we can fix for 2024. The longer-term industrial question requires decisions to be made in a joined-up manner across Europe to make sure that our defense industry is able to sustain this for 3 to 4 years, because the Russians are talking about 3 more years of campaigning. And we have to understand that that is the mindset they're in.
All right, thank you. Now, Dr. Brown.
So regarding the question of sustainability of support, or how to provide support assuming the long term of a war, as mentioned here, 3 or 4 more years perhaps, who knows. I think a very worrying sign is if we look at the countries that we would expect to be the closest supporters of Ukraine. If we look to the region of Central Europe, we have the long-term, relatively, let's say, reluctant approach of Hungary. After recent elections in Slovakia, the new government under Mr. Fico has declared that it will not any longer support Ukraine with military equipment. So these are, of course, worrying signs. In the case of Hungary, often then this is combined with a rhetoric which speaks about the rights of Hungarian-speaking minority in Ukraine. Yes, and of course, maybe we need to be concerned, but on the positive side, though, despite the Hungarian approach, which has been long-term, the country has still agreed to 11 sanction packages of the European Union against Russia and Belarus, and has not intervened to stop support. And there is likely to be a 12 sanction package of the European Union coming in the next few days. And, but of course, the tricky thing is, when we speak of solutions which include integration of Ukraine into both the European Union and NATO, these are processes where each single member state can utilize a veto. So in that sense, it's important to make sure that everyone is aboard. And I think that is one of the main challenges here.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we got 2 more minutes. Any others? Final question, okay.
Right, so my question then goes to...
Please use the microphone, it's better. Yeah.
Thank you. So my question goes to Mr. Wackling. You talked about the need, actually, the first 2 speakers, you both talked about the need to have support behind the military. But in Taiwan's case, there is, I think, a high degree of apprehension towards the military, given its past history, given the abuses its military has been historically involved in, and also some of issues with discipline, training, so on. So how, in this kind of context, do you see building public support behind the military in the Taiwan case, such that they be prepared to fight if necessary? Thank you.
Okay, John, what is that?
Yeah, I think I just 2 pieces of that are, one is the continuing professionalization of the military, right? I mean, I think the great strides have been made, is my understanding. The level of training is increasing significantly. So the first is increasing that professionalization of the military. And the second is educating people on the threat. We know that one country, 2 systems is not a feasible alternative. We know that isolated autocratic regimes will do things that appear to the rest of us to be irrational. So we know that a military invasion is entirely possible. We know that the consequences would be devastating. You know, I think making sure people understand that. I focus more on the U.S. side, making sure that the people in the U.S. understand that from the national security perspective of the United States. The loss of Taiwan, what it would do to the Pacific, what it would do to global trade, what it would do to China's access to the open Pacific, would all be devastating things for our national security. So trying to educate people about that, explaining to them what the challenges are and why we need to be prepared, why we need to be proactive in deterrence, and if, heaven forbid, the awful event occurs, why we need to engage and support. So I think there's a lot of education on both sides of the Pacific that need to occur.
All right. Jack, you want to add something or?
Very briefly, I'm not an expert on the Taiwanese military, so I'd hesitate to comment on the specifics, but I think two things. One, people need to understand that this is a real threat. And if they understand that, then they'll understand why the military is necessary, right? And that assurance that it is a necessary capability helps people buy into it. On the flip side, the military emphasizing that it is there to defend your institutions and that it is there to serve is critical, right? And leadership by the military through service, but service of the country, is a vital element in making sure that the contract between those institutions is robust. But I would hesitate to comment on the specifics because, as I say, it's beyond my expertise.
Okay, I think we have run out of time, so I have to close the panel. And thank you again very much for, very distinguished three guests to share their thoughts and points in this panel. Please give them a big applause. Thank you.
Many thanks to Legislator Zhang for moderating. On behalf of the House, we wish to express our sincere appreciation to all our panelists for this section. Thank you very much. You may now return to your seat. And ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take the short break. For the next section, Conversation 2 will begin at 11:15. Please be advised all guests to be back before 11:15 so we can properly start the next section. Please be advised to bring your valuables with you at all times. Thank you.
我最近试了一个东西，真的很有用啊，所以要分享给大家，那就是太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌。吃了2-3天，真的有明显的感觉。最主要就是睡眠的品质变好喽。那你知道这个睡得好呢，整个人工作就可以更加的专注，当然情绪也就变得更好了。因为太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌，我才认识了这个克菲尔益生菌。它是由多支菌种益生菌所组合而成的，不但是能够维护消化道机能的正常运作，而且呢还有多种有益健康的保健功能，非常的强大。有台大教授专门研究它，把它叫做神仙的礼物。而您知道吗？有上千篇国际研究证实，克菲尔益生菌不仅是帮助肠道健康，肠道菌透过肠脑轴影响全身的器官，所以维持肠道菌种的平衡，这是解锁身体健康、精神健康的钥匙。对于帮助睡眠、维持好情绪，真的是很有感。也因为这不是药，有季节敏感、代谢困扰、关心恶性细胞风险的好朋友们，选择太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌，做好日常的保养，身体轻轻松松，没有负担。每日克菲尔，时刻美好 ，Good Feel Good， 请上快点购为健康下单，也记得输入推荐码，有额外的折扣哦。